Greetings. Today we want to talk about freshwater systems and resources. This chapter will help students describe the distribution of freshwater on Earth and the major types of freshwater systems, discuss how we use water and alter freshwater systems, assess problems with water supply and propose solutions to address the depletion of freshwater, describe the major classes of water pollution and propose solutions to address water pollution, and lastly we want to explain how we treat drinking water and wastewater. Today we're going to begin with a case study called Starving the Louisiana Coast of Sediment. Since the 1930s alone, Louisiana has lost nearly 1,900 square miles of coastal wetlands, and this is an area roughly the size of the state of Delaware. The salt marshes in the river's delta naturally compact over time. This compaction lowers the level of the marsh bottom and submerges vegetation under increasingly deeper waters. So why are Louisiana's wetlands being swallowed by the sea? It's because people have modified the Mississippi River so extensively that much of its sediments no longer reach the wetlands that need them. And in addition to that, levees prevent the river from fanning out into its delta and turn the lower Mississippi into a barrel that shoots sediments off the continental shelf into the deep waters of the Gulf rather than spreading the sediments out. And we can see here just the impact that's happened since 1839, most of these wetlands have really just disappeared. Although Louisiana's economy has benefited from the oil and gas extraction, these activities have also promoted wetland losses. Proposed solutions for coastal erosion center on restoring the system to its natural state by diverting large quantities of water from the Mississippi River into coastal wetlands instead of shotgunning it out in the Gulf and the river's main channel. However, this only solves the sediment problem and not the impacts the oil and gas extraction has on the wetlands. Beginning our lecture, we're going to talk about freshwater systems. Of all the water on Earth, only 2.5% is considered freshwater, and that water is what we think of as relatively pure with few dissolved salts. And most of this water is still tied up in glaciers, ice caps, and aquifers. So water is renewed and recycled as it moves through the water cycle. Precipitation sinks in the ground or it runs off into lakes, which forms our lakes and oceans. And then rivers interact with ponds, wetlands, and coasts. Really just the whole water system interacts with one another. And then there's groundwater exchange between rivers and ponds. Water moves organisms, sediments, and chemicals. There's a lot going on with this whole system. Now here we have an infographic. Oceans are 97.5%, freshwater 2.5%. And then of that 2.5%, 79% of that water is tied up in our ice caps and glaciers. 20% is tied up in groundwater. 1% is surface freshwater, and then that's broken down again into lakes, water within organisms, and various other things. And this comes out to be about 0.02% of water in our Earth's water in the surface water, and even less in Earth's lakes. And this is just another infographic about the water cycle. I think we've talked about this before, but if you want, you can just pause it here and look at it a bit. Groundwater plays key roles in the hydrologic cycle. So surface water is water located on top of Earth's surface, and groundwater is the water beneath the surface, held within the pores in the soil of rocks. Those just really make sense just from the names. Groundwater is often contained within aquifers. They're porous, they're sponge-like, and they're formations of rock, sand, and gravel that hold water. An aquifer's upper layer, or zone of aeration, contains pore spaces partly filled with water. In the lower layer, or the zone of saturation, the spaces are completely filled with water, and the boundary between these two zones is the water table. And here we just have a picture on what we mean by an aquifer. We have the water table and the groundwater. So when a porous, water-bearing layer of rock, sand, or gravel is trapped between upper and lower levels of less permeable substrate, often clay, we have a confined aquifer or artesian aquifer. In such a situation, the water is under great pressure. In contrast, an unconfined aquifer has no impermeable layer to confine it, so its water is under less pressure and can be readily recharged by surface water. And one of the largest aquifers is the Ogallala Aquifer, and we have a picture of it here. It just is across multiple states, and the saturated thickness ranges from 0 to 1,200 feet, and it's up to 200 to 300 miles long at some points. Surface water converges into river and streams ecosystems. As we were saying, the water cycle is it's not just one river; it's the whole system. The rivers, the ponds, lakes, they all interact with each other in the ocean. Once water falls from the sky as rain, emerges from springs, or melts from snow or glaciers, it may soak in the ground or it may flow downhill over land. Water that flows over land is called runoff. And then a tributary, just a quick definition, is a smaller river that slows and goes into a larger river. The area of a land drained by a river system, a river and all its tributaries, is that water's watershed, and it's also called the drainage basin. And then surface water becomes groundwater through infiltration. So when a rain event happens, the water begins infiltrating and might start ponding in the soil, but eventually most of it will infiltrate and go into the local water table. Groundwater becomes surface water through springs or human drilled wells. We had a picture of that earlier. And we use about 492 billion gallons each day in the United States, which is quite a lot of water. It's not very sustainable with how we use it. So going forward, landscapes determine where the rivers flow, but rivers also shape the landscapes through which they run. If you think about the Grand Canyon, it originally was just a river, and in just over thousands of years, it's made the Grand Canyon. There's a couple types of rivers we're going to talk about here. The first one's a braided river, and it's an interconnected series of watercourses that run through steep slopes. A meandering river is a river in the flatter areas, and water rounding a bend erodes soil from the outer bank, sediments deposit on the inside of the bend, and rivers form oxbows, areas where river bends become exaggerated. And then an oxbow lake is a water body formed when erosion cuts off and isolates the oxbow in a U-shape. Now here we have examples of all of them. We have the braided river in Nebraska. It's a lot of little rivers all together. A meandering river in Alaska is pretty lazy looking. I guess that's why they call it meandering. And then we have an oxbow river in Arizona. So areas nearest a river's course that are flooded periodically are said to be within the river's floodplains. And those rivers and streams, they host very diverse ecological communities. So ponds and lakes change over time as streams and runoff bring them sediment and nutrients. There's a couple zones. There's the littoral zone. It's the region ringing the edge of a water body. The benthic zone, the entire body of the water body. Entire bottom of the water body. The limnetic zone is an open portion of the lake or pond where sunlight allows photosynthesis that produces oxygen. Then deeper in the water where the sunlight does not reach is the profundal zone, which lacks plant life. And here we just have a picture of all of them. The benthic there at the bottom, the profundal, the limnetic, and then the littoral. So ponds and lakes, they change over time as streams and runoff bring them sediment and nutrients. I think I accidentally talked about this a little early. But oligotrophic lakes and ponds have low nutrient, high oxygen conditions. And then eutrophic, on the other hand, have high nutrient and low oxygen conditions. And this is where eutrophication may happen from human pollution. Eventually, water bodies may fill in completely through the process of succession. Talked about this in an earlier lecture. Just as many things on our planet, our rivers and our lakes and our water bodies, they're transient. They exist in the moment. They may exist for thousands of years, but they may not exist at some point. The largest lakes we have are known as inland seas, the Great Lakes, the Caspian Sea, Lake Baikal in Russia. Freshwater wetlands are ecosystems that include marshes, swamps, bogs, and vernal ponds. There are systems in which the soil is saturated with water, and that generally features shallow standing water with a lot of ample and distinctive vegetation to wetlands. There's the freshwater marshes. It's a shallow water with plants that grow above the surface. Swamps are shallow water in forested areas. And we were talking about Beavers being an ecological engineer, and Here's an instance where they can just form an entire swamp. It could be due to their dams. Bogs then are ponds covered in thick floating mats of vegetation, and this is a stage in aquatic succession. And then lastly, we have vernal ponds. And here's a picture of, I believe this is a swamp. I'm not entirely sure. So wetlands, they're extremely valuable for wildlife. They host a ton of different species that usually aren't found very many other places, and when they're gone, we can see drastic decreases, upwards of 90% in some of these species. There's tons of valuable ecosystem services. They slow runoff, they reduce flooding, they recharge aquifers, and really importantly, they do filter pollutants before it can get to the ocean. People, they do drain wetlands, and it's a lot of, mostly for agriculture. That's how most of Canada and the United States have lost theirs. And it's because the soil, when something dies and it floats to the bottom, there's an anoxic zone down there because nothing really decomposes, and then nothing decomposes very fast. So the organic matter in these wetlands is very high compared to your regular soil. So they're often drained for farmlands. Wetlands are also affected when we draw water and build dams and levees and introduce pollution. So despite the vital roles played by these wetlands, people have drained them, filled them extensively for agriculture. Wetlands, like any aquatic system, are affected by people when we draw water for human use, build dams and levees, introduce pollutants that alter water's chemical, biological, and physical properties. So human activities affect our waterways. Water is very crucial for human health as well as farms and factories. It's limited but renewable. And withdrawal of water in most of our world is currently unsustainable. We're depleting many sources of our surface water, and 1/3 of the world's people are affected by water shortages. And this is kind of a cycle where we deplete them faster than they can recharge, but we also we pollute the waters we do use, and this water, when it recharges, or sometimes we can't let it recharge because we don't want it to, but if it does recharge, we pollute a whole water table. We've accomplished impressive engineering and accomplishments to harness fresh water throughout the years of being humans. In fact, 60% of the world's largest 127 rivers have been strongly or moderately affected by dams, dikes, and diversions. So one important thing to think about is the fresh water and human populations are unevenly distributed across Earth. So different areas possess different amount of waters, but also they possess different amount of people. So people are not distributed in accordance with the water availability. In some areas, like Asia has the most water of any continent, but the least water available per person. And then densely populated nations in the Middle East, like Pakistan and Egypt. India's not in the least, but India also faces these problems. They face serious water shortage because they have high population densities, but not enough water. And also, fresh water is unevenly distributed in time and not just space. So seasonal rains in some areas lead to differences in water availability throughout the year. India can receive half of its rain in a single monsoon for the whole year. Dams are kind of the fail-safe, and they're used to store water for drier times. And here we have just a brief picture of the available fresh water per capita per year. In the Middle East, you can see there's less than 1,000 cubic meters, and then in America, we have about 5 to 10,000. And in the poles, there's a ton of water up there. So, and then climate change will worsen conditions in many regions. So along with climate change comes altered precipitation patterns. So in some areas they get more water, but inevitably that means other areas may receive less water. And this may exacerbate a problem that's already there. So if the rainfall in a low rainfall region, the precipitation patterns change to less rainfall, and they just have a bigger problem. Melting glaciers, though, are causing early season runoff, and this is leading to intensified droughts and flooding. And 1/3 of the world's major rivers reduced flow from 1948 to 2004, and this has been attributed largely to climate change. So we all know this, water supplies households, industry, and definitely especially agriculture. Globally, we allot about 70% of our annual freshwater use to agriculture. Industry accounts for 20%, and then residential and municipal use account for around the last 10%. When we remove water from an aquifer or surface water body and do not return it, this is called consumptive use. In contrast, non-consumptive use does not remove or only temporarily removes water from aquifer or surface body. So rapid population growth, it means we need more food and we need more clothes. We use 70% of the irrigation water, 70% more irrigation water than 50 years ago. It can more than double crop yields. In fact, only 18% of our land, our agricultural land, is irrigated, but it produces 40% of our crops. But a downside to irrigation is highly inefficient. Water evaporates in flood and furrow irrigation. We talked about this last lecture. There's a couple of different methods of irrigation you can look at. The drip one is definitely one of the more efficient ones. Over-irrigation can then lead to overlogging or salinization, and this has reduced the world farm income by $11 billion. Water use for agriculture is usually subsidized by the government because farmers have, and this leads to farmers having very little incentive to conserve. So even though we talked about the common conventional irrigation method the last lecture, I believe, and how it wasted a good bit of the water, because it's subsidized, farmers really have little incentive to try and conserve it. So excessive water withdrawals can drain rivers and lakes. This just makes sense. There's only so much water. In many places, we're withdrawing way over what we can at a sustainable rate. Many of the world's rivers have been regularly run dry before reaching the sea. The Colorado River, for example, just in the United States, doesn't reach the Gulf of California, and this threatens the future of cities and farms that rely on water. So reduced flow drastically changes river ecology also in plant communities and destroys fish and invertebrates. This is a great case study. It's the Aral Sea. It's in present-day Uzbekistan, and it was once, and Kazakhstan, and it was once the fourth largest lake on Earth. I know National Geographic did a big study into this, and if you have time, I recommend looking it up. There's a lot of great pictures, and it's lost 80% of its volume in 45 years. The two rivers leading into it were diverted to irrigate cotton fields, and 60,000 fishing jobs have been destroyed as a process of it. Pesticide-laden dust is now blown in the air, and little cotton can grow on the salty soil. So it's really kind of destroyed both industries, and you can really just see it from the photos where this used to be a gigantic lake, and now it's just all gone. It's a small body of water. There's just boats left out in the dirt. So worldwide, 15-35% water withdrawals for agriculture are unsustainable. Just talking about that. Water mining is withdrawing water faster than it's replenished. Here's actually a couple pictures of what I was talking about. It's just this big boat out in the middle of the desert, and we have a satellite imaging of it. 1987. This is a big lake that we even called it an inland sea. 2009. Barely any of it's left. And here we just have an infographic that in a lot of industrialized places in the world, America and China, the Middle East, we do have low overuse to high overuse. So groundwater can also be depleted. Groundwater is more easily depleted than surface water because most aquifers recharge very slowly. As aquifers are mined, water tables will drop. So when groundwater is overpumped in coastal areas, salt water from the ocean can intrude into aquifers, making the water undrinkable, and that can really mess up an aquifer. However, sometimes land subsides suddenly, and this is a sinkhole. As areas where the ground gives way with little warning, and occasionally it swallows homes and businesses. Here we have an example. We have a sinkhole in Florida. And falling water tables, they also do vast ecological harm. It's not just the harm that can be done to people through sinkholes. It's just an ecosystem that might have relied on a certain amount of water no longer has that. And as we talk about, evolution is this 1,000-year process. And just one day, or within a span of 10, 20 years, a water table being decreased as much as we're decreasing them can have drastic effects on an ecosystem. Groundwater supplies are bottled water. That really makes sense. Bottled water also exerts substantial ecological impact because it's heavily packaged and because we transport it long distances using fossil fuels. After use, at least 3 out of 4 bottles in the United States are thrown away and not recycled. This is not sustainable use of either water or the petroleum-based plastics. So, we build dikes and levees to control floods. We really like controlling the environment. Flooding is a very normal natural process that occurs when snowmelt or heavy rain swells the volume of water in a river. so that this water can then spill over the river's banks. And in the short term, floods damage property. It is a nuisance to humans, and we do try and control it with levees or dikes or dams. These are defined here. And here's just an example of a levee or dike that's been overrun. Flooding still happens despite as much planning as we do give toward it. When we try to engineer rivers to stay in their channels, we often end up increasing the frequency of floods in downriver areas. So, like I was saying, we like to control things. We divert surface water to suit our needs all the time. We divert it for irrigation. Politically strong, water-poor areas forcibly take water from weaker communities. Los Angeles, for example, commandeered from water from rural areas, turning the environment into desert. It created dust bowls, and it's destroyed the economy. And it's created salinized soils. Now, here's an infographic. I'm not going to go too much into it, but if you want to look at it for a second, I would recommend. So we've erected thousands of dams, and a dam is any obstruction placed in a river or stream to block its flow. Dams create reservoirs, and these are artificial lakes that store water for human use. It's kind of like our water security in some areas. They're prevent floods, provide drinking water, allow irrigation, but also generate electricity. They're very useful. 45,000 large dams have been erected in more than 140 nations, and more than 10,000 of the smaller ones have been built. And only a very few major rivers remain undammed in remote regions of Canada, Alaska, and Russia. Here's an infographic on both the pros and the cons of dams. Pros such as generation of renewable electricity. Cons, 40 to 80 million people displaced by dam projects in the past 50 years. So you can read through this if you'd like. It's very useful information. So dams, I was just saying, the infographic that produces mixed pros and cons. The dam on the Yangtze River, for example, is the largest in the world, and its reservoir stretches for 385 miles, and it provides flood control, passage, huge amount of electricity. However, it did cost $40 billion to build. It flooded 22 cities and the homes of 1.24 million people, and it submerged 10,000-year-old archaeological sites, drowned farmland, wildlife habitat. The tidal marshes now the Yangtze's mouth are eroding, and pollutants may be trapped. It's a large reservoir, so just any pollutant that contaminate the water could potentially contaminate a very large amount of water. Here's the Three Gorges Dam in China. It's actually quite large. And then we have a picture in the bottom here is displaced people. They really did. They uprooted 22 cities, nearly 1.5 million people, and so you got to get out. We got a dam here. Yeah, and then in a lot of these cons, some dams are being removed. Some people feel that the cost of the dams they outweigh the benefits, and they're pushing to dismantle them. And there's a lot of benefits here. We can restore the riparian ecosystems, and these are the ecosystems along the river. And if you dam a river, obviously the flow downstream changes. And really, ecosystems, they react to some of the smallest things. And if you do reduce the flow considerably with a dam, the riparian ecosystems downstream of the dam are vastly impacted. So we can restore those riparian ecosystems. We can reestablish economically valuable fisheries that have been lost, and revive water recreation. Here, I believe this is a guy in a John Deere, or just a deer, it seems, and he looks to be removing a dam. So wetlands are affected by the human manipulations of waterways. We've been talking about this the whole time. I'm going to continue saying it. These systems are interconnected. What we do to the river upstream of wetland does affect the wetland. And as wetlands disappear, we lose many of the ecosystem services they provide us. And again, these are filtering pollutants. They harbor our wildlife, they control floods, and they help us to maintain drinking water supplies. Fortunately, many people today see the value in wetlands and are trying to protect and or restore them. So 1,900 sites have been covering over 185 million hectares have been protected. So what are our solutions to the depletion of fresh water? Our use of fresh water has doubled over the last 50 years, so we can either increase supply or reduce demand. Increasing supply through extensive extraction is only a temporary fix, and diversions increase supply in one area but decrease it somewhere else. So reducing demand is actually really hard politically in the short term. International aid agencies are funding demand-based solutions over supply-based solutions. These offer better economic returns and they cause less ecological and social damage. Okay, so desalination makes water more fresh, and it's a supply strategy with some potential for sustainability, and it's generating fresh water by desalination. It's the removal of salt from water or other water of marginal quality. One method of desalination mimics the hydrologic cycle by evaporating allotments of ocean water with heat and then condensing the vapor, essentially distilling fresh water. Another method forces water through membranes to filter out salts. The most common such process is reverse osmosis. And desalination, however, is very expensive. It requires large inputs of fossil fuels. It kills aquatic life at water intakes and generates concentrated salty waste. Here we have an infographic. We can see here the United States very big in desalination, but also Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq. This makes sense. A lot of the Middle Eastern countries, on the other map we saw, they don't have a large water supply, but they have very large population densities and cultural centers. So over here, it makes a large amount of sense for them to desalinate the water because they have no other water. Agricultural demand can be reduced. Farmers can improve efficiency by lining irrigation canals to prevent leaks, leveling fields to minimize runoff, and adapting more efficient irrigation techniques. Choosing crops to match the land and climate in which they are farmed can also save a huge amount of water. If you have a very dry area with low rainfall, you really shouldn't be growing things that require a lot of water. Selective breeding and genetic modification also can produce crop varieties that produce higher yields with less water. We can lower residential and industrial water use. Each of us can cut our daily water using dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of gallons a day by re-examining aspects of our daily life. So really just think about how you're using water. I know one strategy I've heard of but never done myself is when you shampoo your hair, you turn off the shower. That's a very easy way to do it. And there's a couple other methods. We can install the low flow faucets. Rainwater harvesting I know is kind of big. Xeriscaping, I believe, using plants adapted to arid conditions. And then also industry and municipalities can take water-saving steps as well. Shift the processes to use less water, recycle wastewater, which we'll talk about in a bit. We can use surface water runoff to recharge aquifers, and we can just find and patch leaky pipes. And here we have an example of a home that it's in an arid region, and they're using arid plants. Okay, so market-based approaches to water conservation are being debated. Economists who want to use market-based strategies to achieve sustainable water use have suggested ending the government subsidies of inefficient practices and instead letting water become a commodity whose price reflects the true cost of its extraction. Others worry that making water a fully priced commodity would make it less available to the world's poor and increase the gap between rich and poor. Because industrial use of water can be 70 times more profitable than agricultural use, market forces alone could favor uses that would benefit wealthy and industrialized people, companies, and nations at the expense of the rural poor. The privatization of water supplies has been tried in hope of increasing efficiency, but many people worry that firms have little incentive to allow equitable access to water for rich and poor alike. Decentralization of control over water from the national level to local level can help conserve water. It may improve efficiency, And then lastly, regardless of how demand is addressed, the shift from supply side to demand side solutions is paying dividends. So nations often cooperate to resolve water disputes. One important thing about our water bodies and our lakes and our rivers, they don't really care too much for human boundaries. So a lot of times we will have different water bodies and rivers that go through different nations. And for the nations to get what they want from the water, they have to cooperate. They have to talk to each other. There has to be dialogue entered into. Freshwater depletion has led to shortages, and that can lead to conflict. So 261 of our major rivers, they cross national borders. Water, in fact, is a key element in hostilities among Israel, Palestinians, and the Palestinians and neighboring countries. And also conflicts exist between states in the United States. And this has led to many nations, they have to cooperate with their neighbors to resolve these disputes. India has agreements to co-manage rivers with Pakistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal. And then European nations on the Rhine and the Danube I don't know how to say that one. They have also worked together. And here we can see there's just a lot of water bodies that interact with different nations. Freshwater pollution and its control. Water pollution comes from point and non-point sources. Pollution is technically the release into the environment of matter or energy that causes undesirable impacts on the health or well-being of humans or other organisms. Water pollution then comes in many forms and can cause diverse impacts on aquatic ecosystems and even our health as humans too. Some water pollution is emitted from point sources. Yeah, some are emitted from point sources, and these are discrete locations such as a factory or sewer pipe. And in contrast, pollution from non-point sources is cumulative, and it's arising from multiple inputs, and it's over from a larger area such as farm cities and residential neighborhoods. And it's the major source of pollution in the U.S. Okay, so I think I skipped this slide. We affect our aquatic ecosystems. It makes sense, but we also influence our own health. Half the world's major rivers are seriously depleted or polluted. And then visible pollution of groundwater has been called a covert crisis, because groundwater is the water we can't see, so it's really not something we can see and instantly know. And preventing pollution, we've been saying this, and this is a bit of a theme. Preventing these things from happening is easier and more effective, and require less cost than mitigating it later on. Here we have an infographic of we have the point source on the right and the non-point on the left. And in fact, these point sources, the lines can be blurred sometimes. They can be thought of as non-point too. So water pollution, it takes many forms. One of them is toxic chemicals. Our waterways have become polluted with toxic organic chemicals of our own making. So a lot of this has to do with the farming, the pesticides, petroleum products like water bottles, synthetic chemicals, another part of farming such as like synthetic fertilizers, arsenic, lead, mercury, acid rain, acid. These all find their ways into our waterways. Effects include poison animals and plant. It alters the ecosystems and decreases human health. Scientists, we measure a range of water characteristics to assess water quality, and this can be from the color, the pH, the temperature, the dissolved oxygen, turbidity. There's a ton of variables and characteristics that we study. And solutions that we're looking at, we want to issue and enforce more stringent regulations. I believe DHEC has a large hand in the waterways in South Carolina. We modify industrial processes and our purchasing decisions to rely less on these substances. So maybe just buy a single water bottle and reuse it rather than just keep throwing them out. So another pollution that takes place is pathogens and waterborne diseases. Viruses, protists, bacteria, they all enter our water supplies through our inadequately treated human waste and animal waste from feedlots. Fecal coliform bacteria indicate fecal contamination. These are usually not pathogenic organisms, and they indicate that water may hold other disease-causing pathogens. Bacteria pollution causes more human health problems than any other type of water pollutions. The conditions are improving, but 800 million people lack reliable access to safe water. Treating wastewater and personal hygiene reduce these risks, obviously. Here's another very large one that we've been facing lately. It's the nutrient pollution. This is a lot from fertilizers, farms, sewage, lawns, golf courses, and these all lead to very high nutrient, low oxygen states for waterways, lakes, rivers. This leads to eutrophication. These lead to boosted algal growth. They decrease sunlight. Bacteria eat the dead algae, reducing dissolved oxygen. And this just leads to fish and other invertebrates and just a lot of animals dying. We talked about this before. Areas of low oxygen, they become these dead zones. And our solution to this is reducing the fertilizer application, or we could use phosphate-free detergents, and also just planting vegetation along waterways can increase nutrient uptake from the water. Here's the two things we talked about earlier, the oligotrophic water body. This is very high in oxygen but very low in nutrients. And then on the other hand, we have the eutrophic. I believe this looks like it's covered completely in algae. This is high nutrient, low oxygen. So another thing, another water pollution, we're still talking about it, is biodegradable waste. Wastewater is water that has been affected by human activities, and it can be a source of biodegradable waste. And then sediment is the eroded material carried by rivers. We've talked about that. So clear cutting, mining, and clearing land for housing, it exposes soil to erosion, and it dramatically changes aquatic habitats. Fish may not survive. It can decrease the depth of a river. Solutions to this is better management of farms and forests, and we just want to avoid large-scale disturbance of vegetation, and just decrease erosion, use better practices, land management practices. And this is actually, we're talking about it now as a bad thing, but this is altered sediment is what led to the Louisiana case study we talked about earlier. If the wetlands relied on the very large influx of sediment, but then other ecosystems, they aren't used to an influx of sediment, and their ecosystem is not built around it. So when sediment is introduced into these systems, they react negatively toward it. So a lot of these ecosystem case studies and restorations, it really does depend on the questions you're asking and what you want and the ecosystem type. So the last type of pollution we're talking about is thermal pollution, and it's water that's too warm and it causes problems. Warmer water holds less oxygen. Dissolved oxygen decreases as temperature increases, and industrial cooling heats water. So when you cool something, this generates heat as a waste product, and then this heat waste is often pumped into our waterways. And also, removing streamside cover, like trees and vegetation, it raises water temperature and increases the sunlight that makes it to the river. But water that is too cold also causes problem. Water at the bottom of reservoirs behind dams is really cold, and when water is released, downstream water temperatures, they drop suddenly. This favors cold-loving invasive fish, but also does not favor warmer water-loving fish. So groundwater pollution is it's a difficult problem. Most pollution control efforts focus on the surface water, and we were talking about this earlier. Groundwater is increasingly contaminated, but it's hidden from view. It's not the easiest thing to monitor, and it is that old adage, out of sight, out of mind. It's hard to address in surface water pollution. Rivers, they flush pollutants out eventually, but groundwater, it retains the contaminants. The flux of water within the groundwater is not nearly as high as rivers. It takes longer for contaminants to break down. There's also many sources of groundwater pollution. A variety of chemicals that are toxic at high concentrations include ammonium, fluoride, nitrates, sulfites, and they occur naturally in groundwater. Industrial agriculture and urban waste, from heavy metals to petroleum products, industrial solvents to pesticides, they can leach to the soil and they can seep into our aquifers. Pathogens and other pollutants that can also enter groundwater through improperly designed wells and from pumping of liquid hazardous waste below ground. Leakage of carcinogenic pollutants such as chlorinated solvents and gasoline from underground tanks of oil and industrial chemicals, they also pose a threat to our groundwater. And then in addition to the carcinogenic pollutants, the leaking of radioactive compounds from underground tanks is also a source of groundwater pollution, and billions of dollars have thus far been spent on remediation. Agriculture then contributes to groundwater pollution too. The pesticides, the nitrates, and the pathogens, they don't just find their way into our mobile waterways, they find their way into our groundwater also. And this is just a plant. I don't know if this plant specifically introduced a lot of contaminants, but if the contaminants are mismanaged, they can often find their way into our waterways. And this goes back to the thing we've been talking about a lot, is if managed properly, it's a lot cheaper to do that than to go in later and try and remove the pollutants from our groundwater and our waterways. So legislative and regulatory efforts have helped to reduce pollution, thankfully. Water pollution was way worse decades ago. Citizen activism and government response resulted in the legislation in the 60s and 70s, and rivers and lakes are definitely cleaner now. The Federal Water Pollution Control Act in 1972 was renamed to the Clean Water Act in 77, and I'm pretty sure most of us have heard of this. It makes it illegal to discharge pollution without a permit, and it sets standards for industrial water, wastewater, and it's funded sewage treatment plants throughout the nation. So underfunded and understaffed state and federal regulatory agencies succumb to pressure by industries and politicians who pretty much bribed them, gave them money. Violations of the Clean Water Act have risen to over 100,000 documented violations a year. 10% of Americans are actually unknowingly exposed to unsafe drinking water. And then government action has been taken to help the Great Lakes. The water quality of the lakes have dramatically improved since this intervention. And recent Supreme Court decisions removed enforcement powers of the EPA over many waterways. So this sounds like a pretty much mixed bag of pros and cons. And just as with anything, the Clean Water Act does have pros and cons. On one hand, it does a great job when it works. It's just sometimes it doesn't work. Yeah, so we treat our drinking water. That makes sense. Wastewaters include water that carries sewage. It's water from showers, sinks, and just municipal use. Water used in manufacturing or industrial cleaning processes, but also stormwater runoff. In rural areas, septic systems are the most popular method of wastewater disposal. In a septic system, wastewater runs from the house to an underground septic tank, inside which solids and oils separate from the water. The clarified water proceeds downhill to a drain field of perforated pipes laid horizontally in gravel-filled trenches underground. Yeah, you might not think about your septic system in this way, but it is quite complicated. And then after the gravel-filled trenches, microbes decompose pollutants in the wastewater that these pipes emit. Periodically, solid waste from the septic tank is pumped out and taken to a landfill. In a more densely populated area, however, municipal sewer systems carry wastewater from homes and businesses to a centralized treatment location, and at these locations, pollutants are then removed by physical, chemical, and biological means. At a treatment facility, primary treatment, the physical removal of contaminants take place in settling tanks or clarifiers, and they remove about 60% of the suspended solids. Water will then proceed to secondary treatment, and that water is stirred and aerated so that aerobic bacteria degrade organic pollutants, and then roughly 90% of suspended solids may be removed after secondary treatment. I'm very sorry, I can't read today. Poor thing. And here's just a brief overview of how this happens. You can go through this yourself. It's quite an interesting process, but I've talked about it a little bit, and I don't want to get too much into it. It's already a very long lecture. Oh, another byproduct that we don't think about and isn't talked about too much is sludge. It's a solid material resulting from treatment of wastewater. It's decomposed microbial and digesters. It results in biosolids that are then landfilled, incinerated, or used as fertilizer on cropland. Methane-rich gas created by decomposition can be burned to generate electricity, and 6 million dry tons of sludge are generated in the United States each year. Constructed wetlands can also aid treatment. Natural wetlands have long filtered and purified water. Human constructed wetlands can also do the same thing. After primary treatment at a conventional facility, water can be pumped into the wetland, and microbes can then take the place of secondary treatment by decomposing the remaining pollutants. Cleansed water can be released into waterways or percolate underground. They're havens of wildlife and for human recreation. Wetlands really are neat places. I would recommend you go visit one. They're really cool. The United States has roughly 500 constructed artificially or restored wetlands, and released effluent has helped rebuild coastal wetlands along the Gulf Coast. Here we can see either a constructed or a restored wetland. Definitely looks more restored than constructed to me. So in conclusion, we talked about a lot today. Citizen action, government legislation, and regulation, new technologies, economic incentives, and public education are all working together to help us confront a rising challenge of our new century, ensuring adequate quantity and quality of fresh water for ourselves and the planet's ecosystems. Accessible water comprises a minuscule percentage of the hydrosphere, but we generally take it for granted. And however, there is a reason to hope that we may yet attain sustainability in our water use, and we really have to work together, all facets of society, not just engineers or environmental scientists, but public relations, legislators, just everyone. that's going to be it for this lecture. Thank you again for bearing with me. I apologize for any mistakes.